All right, everybody, let's get started. Happy Friday, everybody. It's March 15th, 2024, and we have a very special guest today. Um, William Cebulskie is from the Penn State area. He's from Pleasant Gap Fire Company. He's the EMS chief there. He will be going to medical school. He's applying very shortly. But the great story about William is that he met Doug Kupas, which many of you know, and Doug said, "Hey, there's this ESO research forum, the PCRF. Why don't you go there?" And he did. And next thing you know, he found himself surrounded by a bunch of other smart people. And the next thing you know, he's winning the best pediatric abstract of the NAMSP, which he's now a member of. So this is the exact pathway where if you're watching this and you're in a leadership position, you ought to be finding people like William and saying, "Hey, you're a smart guy, smart girl. You come on up," and then you bring them, and you actually like help their career tremendously. So, kudos to Doug Kupas and also to William for making that happen. So, without any further ado, William, thank you so much for joining us. It's a very stressful topic for most people, pediatric termination resuscitation. So, if you want to share your screen and take it away, my friend. Thanks for joining.
Like Dr. Antevi said, my name is William. I'm from the Penn State area, and I'm also very excited to have one of the co-researchers on this project, Danielle DeCesare. She is the Associate Medical Director from Orange County, Florida, and she is here, so she's going to help with answering some questions as well. She's been nothing but phenomenal in helping with this project. But again, right, not the easiest subject matter for some people, termination of resuscitation in children. And it took us a little bit to even get to this topic idea. We wanted to definitely do something pediatric focused with, and especially with resuscitation, but we finally got it down to this, and it actually yielded some really interesting results for the future of care for children. And I have no disclosures to make. So the background on this project, it started with us realizing that, pre-hospital termination of resuscitation protocols are used across the United States in adults very widely, and they've become very common and well adapted. Now, furthering that on a little bit, we also took into consideration that EMS care for pre-hospital cardiac arrest has significantly increased and oftentimes mirrors exactly what care is going to be provided to those patients in a hospital or in an emergency department. We've also come to the conclusion that termination of resuscitation protocols have demonstrated much success in reducing futile transports, but more importantly, they have also led to an enhancement of on-scene care for patients in cardiac arrest because we're not rushing and moving to get them into an ambulance and driving down a bumpy road. So it is prioritized that on-scene care, high-quality resuscitation. There are some also, benefits that include, reducing false senses of hope for the family or loved ones whenever a patient gets to the point in which their resuscitation is futile. It also reduces the risk associated with emergency transport of patients who are likely not to survive. But with all of that, there's a lot of research that supports the use of termination of resuscitation pre-hospital in adults, but there was really limited data that existed for the exact same thing in the pediatric population. So that is kind of the background of our project. So our overall objective was to evaluate the rate of EMS transport of patients in cardiac arrest who met pediatric termination of resuscitation criteria. Now, some of you may ask, where did that resuscitation criteria come from? And we're going to get into that. So our methods began, we did a retrospective analysis using the 2022 ESO Data Collaborative, and the data was all analyzed using descriptive statistics, and our primary outcome was EMS transport. So when we were working on this, we identified 911 EMS responses for all patients aged 0 to 17 years that were in cardiac arrest prior to EMS arrival and in which resuscitation was attempted by EMS. We excluded drownings, EMS witnessed cardiac arrests, and cases that there was no documented ECG readings or end-tidal capnography. So continuing on with the methods, we use the Maryland Pediatric Termination of Resuscitation criteria. So in case some of you don't know, the state of Maryland does have a protocol that is in place and being used now for termination of resuscitation in pediatric patients. This was all previously validated criteria, so we felt very comfortable using it, and that was the Harris et al. Paper, and it was published in 2021. So it is broken down based on etiology of the cardiac arrest. So there was medical and trauma. So in the medical group, these patients had to meet 15 2-minute, 15 2-minute cycles of CPR, 1 dose of epinephrine. They had to have asystole or a non-shockable rhythm and an end-tidal CO2 of less than 15 in order to be considered for field termination. The trauma group is similar but a little different with the CPR cycles. So in the trauma etiology group, the EMS had to complete 5 2-minute cycles of CPR. The patient also had to have a non-shockable rhythm or be in asystole, and their end-tidal CO2 had to be less than 15. So what we did for the approximation of CPR is we used an on-scene time of greater than 30 minutes, and then an on-scene time of greater than 10 minutes for the trauma arrests. And although it's not completely perfect, that was what we used as our proxy to just approximate the CPR cycles and time requirement that these patients would have had to meet. So here we have a little bit of a breakdown of our how we got to our sample size. So we started with over 100,000 adult and child cardiac arrests. We excluded all of those that had a missing age or that were older than 18. So that left us with children 18 or younger, and with just about 3,400 included there. Then we excluded those that had no resuscitation attempted. And then furthering on, we excluded any patients that had a transfer of care at some point or that refused against medical advice. So we were a little confused how there were some that refused medical advice with the whole cardiac arrest situation, but there were a couple, so we excluded them. We then further on and we excluded drownings. And a lot of people were kind of curious as to why we excluded drowning patients. And this was just based on some of the research that we looked at that showed that patients that had a cardiac arrest due to drowning had a higher probability of survival. So we didn't want that to skew the data. So we excluded pediatric drownings. We then excluded those that had no ECG recorded and then no end-tidal CO2 recorded, which left us with a total sample size of 1,278 patients. We did think that it was kind of interesting that we had to exclude nearly 1,000 pediatric arrests because there was no end-tidal CO2 documented for their care. So then to kind of break it down by etiology of the cardiac arrest, a majority of those in our sample had a medical etiology, 87%. And then the rest were trauma, which left us with about 13% of our overall sample. So getting into our results a little bit. So like I just said, we had a lot more patients that experienced a medical etiology arrest. So whenever we started to look at our results, we also thought that that was a little interesting given the higher rates of trauma arrests, which I'm going to get into in older children. So, but looking here, 87% of the patients included in the sample were transported by EMS. So 1,110 were still transported. 27% of the patients transported had documented return of spontaneous circulation. So after that, we looked, only 9% of medical etiology arrests met the pediatric termination of resuscitation criteria that we used to complete this analysis. When we looked at the trauma side, 34% of the traumatic arrests met the pediatric termination of resuscitation criteria. Sorry, had a little technical difficulty there. But furthering on with our results, of those that were meeting the pediatric termination of resuscitation criteria for medical etiology cardiac arrests, 34% were transported. And of those meeting the pTOR criteria for traumatic etiology cardiac arrests, 73% were transported by EMS. So of the patients that were transported by EMS without ROSC during the EMS encounter, just over 800, 9% of the medical etiology cardiac arrest met the 30-minute minimum on-scene time for termination eligibility. When we looked at the trauma side, 58% of the traumatic etiology arrests met the 10-minute minimum scene time for termination of eligibility. And of course, we did have several limitations with our study, including retrospective review, and we had the inability to consider conditions on scene that would have inhibited EMS clinicians from safely performing pediatric termination of resuscitation. We understand that the data doesn't show those emotional and potentially safety concerns on scene. So in conclusion, 1 in 3 patients meeting medical etiology pediatric termination of resuscitation criteria, and nearly 3 out of 4 patients meeting the traumatic etiology pTOR criteria were still transported by EMS. In the medical etiology cardiac arrest, most patients without any ROSC were transported by EMS prior to meeting scene time or CPR cycle requirements to even have them considered for termination of resuscitation eligibility. So in identifying that, we can see that it's suggestive that we're still using a scoop and run or a load and go approach to pediatric cardiac arrest management in the pre-hospital setting. So with that, we may be able to consider that these practices may reduce high quality resuscitation attempts on scene. And we've seen from other research that the prioritization of on-scene management and stabilization of patients in cardiac arrest has led to better outcomes. And that is all that I have now, and I'm going to open it up for questions and go from there.
All right, William, amazing. And first of all, if you want to tell folks, just to make sure I have it right, this won the best pediatric presentation at NAMSP?
Correct.
Awesome, wonderful. And the follow-ups I have are the following: the Maryland TOR criteria, which you had mentioned, they, I believe, found in their paper that the items, the children that they were missing were the drownings, and that's why you actually removed drownings from your criteria, correct?
Correct.
So, did you have the ability, and I guess it's a retrospective review, so it wasn't easy to do, to actually find out why people are practicing medicine this way? I mean, this is obviously a problem that we all know that we have. I've tried to get my folks to at least spend the time on scene. Whether they transport or not is a whole nother ball of wax, right? What I've tried to do is get people just to actually do the work on scene.
Mm-hmm.
And then very few, if any, would actually terminate. At least in South Florida, when you look at our CARES data, and we all know this is a problem, even for adults, our termination rate is 4%, whereas the United States, if you look at CARES data, it's 40%. So we are having a problem with both adults and children with termination. So that's one big issue. But the other issue really that you're highlighting is they didn't even give this child a chance for a good outcome because they just used diesel fuel instead. Were you able to figure out why in this case, or because it's a retrospective review, you weren't able to elucidate that information? Is that correct?
Unfortunately, due to the retrospective nature of it, we were not able to get any, solid scientific side of, the evidence to, to say one way or another. However, through just general analysis from all of us on the research team and talking to people about this, there were some like overlying themes as to why people were against, pediatric termination or working a pediatric cardiac arrest on scene for that amount of time. Some of it came down to a lack of understanding from bystanders or family as to what level of care EMS is providing, and that we can provide high quality cardiac resuscitation on scene. And on top of that, a lot of other physicians and EMS clinicians that have explained this. It seems that there are some medical directors who still are not on board or open to working pediatric cardiac arrest for that long on scene. So I think there's some just thematic review, in talking with people. Those are two big areas. I mean, of course, there are a lot of EMS clinicians that also express that they aren't overly comfortable with kids. So I think that there's some things to be said for how we're educating EMS clinicians. But in general, those were like the three bigger themes that we had all heard. And I don't know if Danielle, if you have anything to kind of add on to that.
Yeah, I think, when we went into this study, we were really looking at termination or percentage of termination on scene. And I don't think anyone in this group was surprised that there's a low termination of specifically pediatric patients. What truly took us off guard was how quickly people were getting off scene, like, getting to the hospital and not staying on scene to do high quality CPR. So I think like the initial kind of endpoint of the study was seeing kind of like what people were doing around the nation regarding termination and was anyone using this criteria. But once we actually got the results, we were like, holy cow, we're not even giving these kids a chance. And so that wasn't necessarily the answer that we were looking for, but that's what we got. And so, yeah, I think it was definitely eye-opening to see, still doing a scoop and run with peds resuscitation.
Thanks, Danielle. I'm going to bring in Dr. Pepe here in a second. I'm very opinionated on this topic, as many of you know. And I think part of the problem is that we're taking our orders, if you will, from a group of people who are not EMS physicians. And I think the National Association of EMS Physicians needs to take a stance on this. We have to take over the resuscitation guidelines away from ICU doctors and ED docs and put them in the hands of board-certified EMS physicians. Enough is enough, and that, in my opinion, is the biggest problem. But Dr. Pepe has done a lot of work in this arena. So, Dr. Pepe, what is your sage advice or your thoughts on this topic?
So, first of all, what I wanted to make sure I understand is the difference between I thought this was about terminating on scene versus scoop and run versus doing the work on it. Those are two separate questions. So right. Did you try both of those, or it sounded like you did, I guess. But I want to know what was the principal question that you're asking here.
Yeah, so the principal question that we went into this looking at was what patients are we transporting, pediatric patients, I should say, are we transporting that meet the termination of resuscitation criteria? So that was our primary objective. When working through all this, we found then that most of the patients weren't even eligible for the termination criteria because they were not meeting the scene time requirements.
Got it. Okay, got it. Okay, so I get it now. All right, so thank you, and this is important work, so thank you for doing it. Okay, so a couple things that I'll try to. There's so much material, and then what we should do is we could talk offline. Has this paper been published yet, or are you writing it up? Where are you?
Yeah, it's we're working on actually, Danielle and I just met this morning. We're working on the publication now.
Well, let's talk offline. I'll help you with several things on this. Okay, so first of all, if you look at the work done in Florida by Banerjee in Polk County, they actually saw that this was a real problem, and what they did aggressively was because here's the point: you have to know what it's like on scene. When you have screaming family members and they absolutely say, get them to the hospital, fix them right away, you're uncomfortable with this situation because you don't do it all the time. And so I could go on and on, all the reasons, but they're very, I think, understandable reasons for wanting to rush off scene or even get to the ambulance. And what they said in that study was that it's like by that time, these patients are already way down the line because it's not like a VF patient who arrested a couple of minutes ago and still has got a blood full of oxygen. We're talking about these kids that most of the time went into a hypoxic arrest and therefore, were way behind the 8 ball, and you have to do it right then and there. And they had better outcomes when they did it there. So on scene. But the point was, what did they do? They made everybody more comfortable with doing this. They also did training about, the verbal judo and various other things, and to be able to look the patient's family comfortably in the eyes. If we don't do it now, we'll not get them back. and there's not much else to offer the hospital. So those are, I could go on and on, but they did a lot of things, interventions to make it more comfortable. Then as they got more successful, by the way, resuscitating kids, they were very comfortable with those statements that they were making to the family members. So I'm all in favor of what Peter is saying. Let's get it done on the scene, et cetera. And I think it showed that it made a difference in outcome. So that's a whole separate issue in a training area. And I think that you're addressing that. And I think that's important. Now, on the termination resuscitation, and that's a tough one too. And I actually studied this about, 30 years ago. And one of the things is the paramedic comfort level with, sitting here with the family. That one's a tough one in many situations. And so a lot of the times there may be better support systems in the hospital, but the question is, should you rush through traffic, with the lights and sirens with a kid that's clearly futile? So, but it's still an interesting question. And so that plays into it as well. And by the way, one other thing that helps, we have the rescuers are actually the ones who are a little bit victims here psychologically, not only the parents, but because that's one of the most challenging things to deal with. And Peter's done a very good job actually down in Florida of training their people, having the plan ahead of time, and it makes it less, anxious at the time of the scene. Then finally, on the trauma end, that's a whole nother issue, and there may be recoverable organs in many of these situations. And so that may be worthwhile there, especially if they meet criteria for termination. So we just may want to also revisit this and say, when is it acceptable to rush them through there to get the salvage organs, and or when is it acceptable to terminate on scene and then bring the patient in with family for psychosocial support, or do you have support systems going to the scene? So there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. But I'll shut up at this point because it's like I'm giving another lecture. I don't mean to do that. So, but I'll be glad to help you guys out later on with writing up the paper too, because I have a lot of research that we did previously on this.
Awesome, Dr. Pepe, great, and William and Daniela are definitely taking him up on that. So there's a lot of questions coming in. Let's start with Larry.
One other thing.
He says, "Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead."
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add one other thing. Just so people know, obviously we weren't trying to revalidate the criteria that we used, but just so that you do know, whenever we looked at the hospital linked outcomes that we did have for some of the patients, of the patients that met the termination of resuscitation criteria and that were still transported by EMS, there was not one survivor. So just to throw that out there to everyone again as well.
That's a very interesting feedback and result. So Larry and Scott kind of both have similar comments. Let me start with Larry McCarter. He says, in Pennsylvania, a medic can terminate a patient, adult or pediatric, only after medical command orders it. Perhaps a lot of the numbers here are dependent on the MC background and history. And then Scott says, this is true in Massachusetts as well. Getting orders for termination in a traumatic arrest is almost non-existent. All-cause PD arrest is basically a no as well. And a lot of the medical control in metro areas are ED residents. So Scott, let's start with you, and then we'll move over to Larry. Comment on the study, and then what your perceptions are in Massachusetts.
Well, on the study, well done. I mean, doing retrospective analysis through ESO data is limited, but it's kind of the best we have sometimes. So I think your results were interesting. I wasn't overly surprised that PDs had that. You found what you found with pediatrics, because there's so many things that play into that. And I do think that there is such variability across the country in what paramedics are allowed to do when it comes to either field termination or on-scene times in termination. And it's not well trained in a lot of areas. I'm a little bit of unique here where I work both in Mass and New Hampshire. So Eric Yeager's comment about New Hampshire is also true down below it. In New Hampshire, we don't need medical control to terminate, adult or PD, any cause. The field provider on scene can make the call after a predetermined amount of time and meeting certain criteria. In Massachusetts, you need to get medical control to terminate a code for any reason. Massachusetts is a little unique. I work in the Metro Boston area. All the medical control there is done through the academic medical centers for the most part. So to kind of on what you said, Dr. Antevi, about you need EMS physicians. It's not uncommon to get a PGY2 on July 3rd answering the med control phone, right? You can escalate that, but you've got to, as a field paramedic, it's usually the guys like me with the gray hair, who will demand an attending on the phone if I'm not getting what I want. But most of the paramedics don't do that. So they'll get a fairly inexperienced ED resident, and a lot of times they're not comfortable making those tough calls. I've heard a lot of recordings that just said, bring them to me and let me take a look, for all sorts of things. So I do think that your call for having more experienced physicians, I would love EMS board certified physicians. There's just not a lot of them around me. But having more experienced physicians answering those calls, making those judgment calls based on what the field providers are saying would definitely be helpful. But I have not seen in 28 years or so, I don't know that I've heard of a pediatric arrest being terminated in the field.
Yeah, I will. I mean, they're very few and far between. I'm going to drop into the chat in a minute an article I wrote for EMS World when we had exactly, it was like the case of a lifetime where you had 7 of my frontline paramedics who did not who wanted to take this kid off the scene, but we had an amazing EMS captain who said no. He was right. They were pissed. Anyway, I wrote the story, which is a very emotional story, but it's hard. I don't see Larry's on video, so I'm going to go to Eric because you also made a comment. Eric, Scott mentioned you a few times. What's your thoughts here?
My thoughts are, first off, extremely well done study. I'm already eager to see the next iteration of this study. I would love for them to go back and ask paramedics about both their decision to remain on scene for an insufficient period of time to ensure an effective resuscitation. What were the barriers to doing that? And I would love to understand their hesitation on implementing the pTOR criteria. As Scott mentioned, we in New Hampshire, we have the capacity to make that decision. I will say I am familiar with multiple cases where providers have made that decision, but to terminate a pediatric resuscitation on scene, but they've been typically in unusual circumstances. I would echo the call you gave, Peter. We need to get control of these guidelines, and we need to get better education out there for EMS providers on how to implement these, how to properly perform pediatric resuscitation on scene. I was in a class just this morning where I had exactly those conversations. They're difficult conversations, but we need to begin them and continue to have them. Because as we know from the adult realm, how long did it take for us to get EMS providers comfortable with terminating adults on scene? That was a 5 to 10 year transition. If we don't have those conversations, we're not going to begin to make progress. And I appreciate your leadership on this topic, because it really has inspired me to ensure that when I do this education, that I'm talking with providers about. I literally looked at a white shirt this morning and said, when they hand the baby to your provider and you put them in the back of the ambulance, are you going to stay on scene to conduct that resuscitation, or are you going to start driving towards the hospital? And he said, we're going to stay on scene. And I said, are you prepared to have the conversation with mom and dad to explain to them why the ambulance is remaining on scene? And he said, yes, I am.
I do think,
Amazing.
not to jump
Okay.
in, but I do think what Eric just said is kind of where we might be able to move the needle in the Northeast. The termination is a different question, but the staying on scene to resuscitate until it's futile, and then get into what Dr. Pepe was saying about maybe it's a transport for social mental reasons or for organ harvesting or that kind of thing. That's a different question, I think, a little bit. If we could get providers up here to, I don't see this problem with the adults. They will work those for 20, 30 minutes. But with kids, that scoop and screw mentality, and they don't sit on scene working them for a variety of reasons. And I think that's an area where we can make a dent faster.
Yes, I agree. We're at the bottom of the hour, and but I want to kind of end where we started, which is with Doug Kupas. So Doug, you're here. You had a big impact in William's trajectory here, and I know you joined us a little late, but I wanted to just call you out and thank you for doing that. You have, I see you have the comment here about the 15% TOR rate in kids compared to the 40 for adults. But do you want to make any other comments as we end?
Oh, thanks, Peter. And I apologize. I had a really high-level meeting that kept me from being on the first half of this. But Will's a rock star. We are working to get published a CARES based database that shows about a 30% field termination of rate in the same years in adults and 15% in kids. So people that think that this is not done in kids, it's not exactly true. It's about half the rate of adults, but it is done quite frequently. My agency's trained people to have those conversations, and we've done it for 30 years. Some of you may have heard of the case of the baptism before doing a field termination. But it's really educating your people to communicate with both the adults and the pediatric survivors about these situations. And I agree that the most important thing that can come out of this is working them longer at the scene, like Paul Banerjee showed dramatic increase in survival.
Excellent. A great comment. So I'm gonna come to Lou, and then in the meantime, for those of you who want to hop over to Paul's webinar, the link is there at the bottom. But go ahead, Lou. Comment.
Yeah, just one quick thing. A lot of it also depends on the location. If you're at the patient's home, it's easy to terminate there. If you're in a public place, a kid who choked and you found him at the school, in the bathroom, on the field, you don't want to have that left, a body with a sheet over it in a public place. And someone mentioned loading in the ambulance. Just one quick anecdote. One morning we had a call, woman brought out a SIDS baby, loaded up, the baby was dead. Well, now you're out of service for 3 hours because you've become a crime scene with an unattended death. So once you load, you're pretty much obligated to keep going in transport or facing the possibility, if you terminate there, of what might happen afterwards.
So I'm glad you mentioned that, Lou, because in Parkland, they brought out the girl that I ended up treating, and there's helicopters above. I have a girl in the back of the ambulance who is clearly futile, and I had to make a decision. Do I just open the doors back up and bring her outside? I decided not to do that, and we ended up going to the hospital, and we ended up doing everything in the back of the truck. But you bring up a very good point on that. I'm going to do one other thing because you alluded to. I'm just going to get the link right here. Everyone should know about the paper that was done in 2021 by the folks in Maryland. It's also through ESO. I put a link to my entire PowerPoint, but it starts on slide 7, and it goes back to what Will and his team were using, which is the Maryland TOR criteria. Look at those criteria, because for medical TOR, pediatric TOR, if you followed it, it was like some 98% accurate, right? So we have a lot of work to do. I'm gonna stop here. I know Pat Frost had a few questions, and maybe I'll just get those to William. He can answer them separately. So sorry that we didn't get to John Halpern's questions, Ayana Walker's comments, but Will, this was probably the most. This talk probably generated the most comments out of any talk we've ever had. And clearly we probably needed another 30 minutes on this. So thanks everyone for joining. And Danielle, thank you for your research. Thank you guys for contributing to the evidence base. I know Doug has heard me say this over and over again. So it's not that I say it without him present, but NAEMSP needs to own out of hospital cardiac arrest for both kids and adults. And I know that with his leadership, he's working towards that. I know there's politics involved. I get it, but when just to kind of tie the knot together here, when you're a medic and you're calling a non-EMS medical director, like a PGY2, as Scott mentioned, or an ED doc, they have no idea what we do in the field. Zero. And I tell all my folks, I'm on call 24/7, 365, and I want you to call me or my team. Right? We have a big team now, so. We have to move in that direction. We have to peel away. We're our own specialty. We have to own that, folks. And this study is just another proof. Is more proof that we have a lot of work to do. So, Will, I'm going to give you the last word. Take us away, my friend. Thank you so much for what you do, and good luck getting into medical school. Give us the last word.
Yep, thank you, and just thank you all again for having me. And I know it was a kind of a rough topic area, but I think it's definitely going to lead to some good discussion and better practices for EMS. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thank you. Great job. Thanks, Will. Thanks, Danielle. And we'll see you guys. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'm going to stick around for 30 more seconds or about so. And I'm going to head over to the Peppy show as well. So thanks, everyone. Take care.